great news is I don't think I ever have to do it again. Some of it is very surreal. I to this day, I'm not sure how I created such chaos and wound up in that headspace.
Charlie Sheen didn't fall quietly. He didn't disappear into obscurity. He didn't fade out with dignity or retreat from the spotlight. He exploded, and that explosion wasn't sudden. It was decades in the making. Before the headlines, before the breakdowns, before the words winning and tiger blood became cultural punchlines, Charlie Sheen was something else entirely. He was Hollywood royalty's most promising heir, and for a time, he was unstoppable. Charlie Sheen was born Carlos Irwin Estevez in 1965 into a world already wired for fame. His father was Martin Sheen, a respected, intense, politically vocal actor who believed deeply in craft, discipline, and purpose. A man who treated acting as something serious, almost sacred. Charlie grew up watching his father transform into other people, learning early that identity could be fluid, that applause could be addictive, and that cameras could define a life. But unlike Martin, Charlie didn't want to earn respect. He wanted speed, he wanted chaos, and he wanted to win.
No, he was overheard by Alan Ruck.
Yeah.
It's a story in the book, saying, you know, find out what you can about the brunette.
From a young age, Charlie showed signs of raw charisma. Not polished, not refined, but magnetic. People noticed him before he spoke. Casting directors noticed him before he proved himself, and Hollywood noticed him because of his name, even if he pretended that didn't matter. He dropped out of high school just weeks before graduation, not because he failed, because he didn't care. Hollywood was calling, and rules were already optional. Charlie's first roles came quickly, too quickly. Platoon, Wall Street, Young Guns. These weren't small parts. These were defining films of an era. And Charlie didn't just appear in them, he stood out. He had the look, he had the edge. He had that reckless, unbothered energy that cameras love and producers fear. But behind the scenes, something else was forming, a pattern. While his peers worried about longevity, Charlie chased sensation. Parties weren't rewards, they were routine. Substances weren't escapes, they were fuel. And consequences, those were for other people. By the late 1980s, Charlie Sheen was everywhere. Magazine covers, box office hits, industry buzz, and yet quietly, studio executives were already nervous. Because Charlie was brilliant on screen, but unreliable off it. Late arrivals, missed rehearsals, wild nights bleeding into shooting days. At first it was tolerated. Talent buys patience, then it escalated. In 1990, Charlie's name became associated with something darker, something that couldn't be brushed off as youthful rebellion. The overdose incident that nearly killed him wasn't just a scare, it was a warning, and Hollywood saw it. But instead of slowing down, Charlie accelerated. The early 1990s were chaos disguised as success. Films kept coming, money kept flowing, fame kept growing, and with it, so did the myth that Charlie Sheen was untouchable. That myth became his shield and his curse. By the mid-1990s, his personal life had turned into a tabloid spectacle. Relationships burned fast and ended violently. Arrests followed. Lawsuits piled up. But every time it seemed like this would be the end, another role appeared. Another paycheck, another chance. Hollywood doesn't forgive. It forgets, as long as the cameras keep rolling. Then came television, and everything changed. When Charlie Sheen landed 2.5 Men, it wasn't just a role, it was a resurrection. The show was built around him, his charm, his sarcasm, his unapologetic excess. For millions of viewers, Charlie Harper wasn't a character. It was Charlie Sheen with the volume turned down just enough to be broadcast friendly. The ratings were massive. The money was obscene. At his peak, Charlie Sheen was earning over $1.8 million per episode, more than movie stars, more than most CEOs, more than almost anyone on television, and that money reinforced the illusion that he could do anything, say anything, be anything. But success doesn't erase addiction, it feeds it. Behind the laughter track, Charlie's life was unraveling again. Rehab stints became routine. Public apologies became scripted. Studios issued statements instead of solutions. Everyone involved believed the same lie, that the show mattered more than the man. Then came the interviews, the rants, the spiral. When Charlie Sheen went public with his breakdown, the world didn't know how to react. Was it performance? Was it illness? Was it manipulation? He spoke in fragments. He declared himself victorious. He attacked his own creators, and suddenly, the joke wasn't funny anymore. Hollywood did what Hollywood always does when someone becomes inconvenient. It cut him loose. Charlie Sheen didn't lose 2.5 Men because of one interview. He lost it because the illusion finally broke. The money stopped justifying the chaos. And once that happens, the industry moves on fast. But Charlie didn't disappear. He doubled down. And that decision would define the next chapter of his life. The success of 2.5 Men didn't stabilize Charlie Sheen. It anesthetized him. For a while, it made everything feel manageable. The schedule was predictable. The jokes were written for him. The audience loved him exactly as he was. There was no pressure to evolve, only to show up and deliver sarcasm on cue. But addiction does not respect routine. It exploits it. Behind the scenes, Charlie's life was becoming a closed loop of excess and denial. Long nights blurred into early mornings. Substances became less about pleasure and more about maintenance. What once felt rebellious now felt necessary just to function. And yet, the show kept winning. Ratings climbed, awards followed, contracts grew heavier. Every time Charlie crossed a line, someone else erased it for him. Producers adjusted schedules around his absences. Writers softened dialogue when he wasn't sharp. Crew members learned not to ask questions. Lawyers handled what managers couldn't. This wasn't loyalty. It was fear. Fear that removing Charlie would collapse the entire machine. At the height of his power, Charlie Sheen wasn't just the star of the show. He was the show. That made him dangerous. The turning point didn't come all at once. It came in fragments. Missed rehearsals that became public knowledge. Hospital visits that leaked to the press. Rehab stints that felt performative rather than restorative. Charlie would apologize, promise change, smile for cameras, and then repeat the cycle. What made this different from earlier collapses was scale. This wasn't a young actor burning himself out. This was the highest paid man on television unraveling in real time, and everyone was watching. The public breakdown didn't start with anger. It started with confidence. A strange, unsettling confidence that bordered on delusion. Charlie began speaking as if he had transcended consequence, as if rules no longer applied to him, as if reality itself had bent to accommodate his survival. He wasn't losing control. He believed he had mastered it. Then came the language. Winning, tiger blood, Adonis DNA. These weren't jokes. They were declarations, and they revealed something deeply unstable beneath the bravado. For the first time, the audience wasn't laughing with him. They were watching him, trying to figure out whether this was performance art or psychological collapse. Inside the studio, patience evaporated. The creator of 2.5 Men, Chuck Lorre, became a target of Charlie's rage. Interviews turned into attacks. Private disputes became public spectacle. Charlie didn't just criticize, he was humiliated. And humiliation is unforgivable in Hollywood. Networks don't fire stars easily, but they do it decisively when they must. Charlie Sheen was removed from the show not because of moral outrage, but because unpredictability became bad business. Insurance premiums skyrocketed. Schedules became impossible. The risk outweighed the reward. The industry that once protected him turned its back overnight. Charlie's response wasn't a reflection. It escalated. He went on tour, not to apologize, to perform. The My Violent Torpedo of Truth tour was chaotic, disorganized, and deeply uncomfortable. Audiences paid to see the man they once admired, only to realize they were watching someone unravel without a script. Some laughed, some walked out, most left confused. This was no longer rebellion, it was exposure. For the first time in his career, Charlie Sheen had no structure, no studio oversight, no writing team, no safety net. And without those boundaries, the persona he had built began to collapse under its own weight. Addiction thrives in isolation, and isolation is exactly what fame gives you when the applause stops. Charlie tried to maintain relevance through headlines, through shock, through confrontation. But attention without respect is corrosive. It doesn't nourish ego, it erodes it. Then came the revelation that changed everything. Not a rant, not a lawsuit, a confession. When Charlie Sheen disclosed his HIV diagnosis, the tone shifted instantly. The jokes stopped, the outrage softened, the spectacle turned serious. For the first time in years, the public saw vulnerability instead of bravado. And behind that vulnerability was a lifetime of risk, denial, and silence. Charlie revealed that he had been living with the diagnosis for years. That fear, secrecy, and shame had shaped his behavior more than anyone realized. The chaos suddenly had context, not justification, but an explanation. For a moment, the world paused. Sympathy replaced ridicule. Questions replaced judgment. But damage doesn't disappear when truth emerges. By then, relationships were broken. Careers had moved on. Trust was gone. Hollywood doesn't wait for recovery. It waits for profitability. Charlie Sheen survived. But survival is not the same as redemption. What followed was quieter. Smaller roles, lower profiles, attempts at normalcy that felt foreign to someone raised in excess. The myth of Charlie Sheen had died. What remained was a man trying to exist without it. After the noise faded, what remained was silence. Not the peaceful kind. The kind that exposes everything you were able to avoid hearing while the world was loud. For Charlie Sheen, this was unfamiliar territory. For most of his life, chaos had been a buffer, fame had been a shield, even scandal had been a form of company. There was always a camera, a headline, a reaction. Now, there was distance. Hollywood did not formally exile Charlie Sheen. It simply stopped calling. That distinction matters because in this industry, relevance is oxygen. You can survive bad press. You can even survive public disgrace. What you cannot survive is indifference, and indifference is exactly what followed. Charlie attempted to recalibrate. He spoke about sobriety more seriously. He appeared measured in interviews. He tried to reframe his past as a cautionary tale rather than a punchline, but time had moved on. The industry had changed, the audience had aged, and the persona that once felt rebellious now felt exhausting. There is a moment that comes for many fallen celebrities when they realize something painful. They are no longer being rejected. They are being replaced. Streaming platforms rose. New stars emerged. Television shifted away from the kind of multi-camera sitcoms that made Charlie untouchable. The environment that once protected him no longer existed. And without that ecosystem, his old power meant very little. This is where the story often gets misunderstood. People assume the fall was punishment. It wasn't. It was erosion. Charlie Sheen did not lose his place in Hollywood because of one scandal or one diagnosis or one rant. He lost it because over time, he became unmanageable, not morally, operationally, and Hollywood does not negotiate with instability when profit is uncertain. Privately, Charlie's world had shrunk. Relationships that once revolved around access and indulgence disappeared when access dried up. The party crowd vanished. The constant validation evaporated. What remained were the people who had always been there and the ones he had pushed away. His relationship with his father, Martin Sheen, took on new weight during this period. Martin had spent decades advocating for responsibility, activism, and introspection. He had walked his own difficult path, battled addiction, and rebuilt his life deliberately. For years, Charlie resisted that example, not out of disrespect, but because it represented restraint. Now, restraint was unavoidable, and the contrast between father and son became impossible to ignore. Martin had built a legacy rooted in credibility and discipline. Charlie had built one fueled by charisma and excess. Both paths led to fame. Only one sustained it. This realization did not arrive all at once. It arrived in fragments, missed opportunities, conversations that didn't go anywhere, roles that never materialized, each one reinforcing the same truth. The world had moved on. Charlie began speaking more openly about accountability, not in the dramatic language of his past, but quietly, almost cautiously. He acknowledged harm. He acknowledged denial. He acknowledged that addiction had shaped decisions he could no longer undo. These were not redemption speeches. They were admissions. But accountability does not guarantee forgiveness, and forgiveness does not guarantee relevance. There is a particular loneliness that comes with surviving your own legend. People recognize your name. They remember your peak, but they do not expect anything from you anymore. Expectation is a form of respect. Its absence is something else. Charlie Sheen did not disappear completely. He worked sporadically. He appeared occasionally. He existed. But the cultural force he once was had faded. And that may have been necessary, because only when the person died could the man breathe. The most difficult part of Charlie's journey was not the public collapse. It was private reckoning. The realization that charm cannot substitute for care. That talent cannot outrun addiction forever. That fame does not protect you from yourself. In moments of reflection, Charlie has spoken about regret, not in sweeping statements, but in specifics. Relationships that could not be repaired, time that could not be reclaimed, versions of himself that never had the chance to grow. And yet, there is something quietly human in that, because this is not a story about a villain. It is a story about excess meeting its limit. Charlie Sheen was never just reckless. He was searching for intensity, for validation, for control in a life that never slowed down long enough for him to understand it. The tragedy of his rise and fall is not that he lost everything. It's that he had everything before he knew how to hold it. Today, Charlie Sheen exists in a different space, not as a cautionary headline, not as a punchline, but as a reminder of what happens when fame arrives before self-awareness, of what happens when systems enable instead of intervene, what happens when winning becomes the only metric that matters. Charlie Sheen's story is often told like a joke with a tragic punchline. But that framing misses the point, because what happened to him wasn't an anomaly. It was an outcome produced by a system that rewards excess, protects profitability, and abandons people only after they are fully consumed. Hollywood did not create Charlie Sheen's addiction, but it fed it. It didn't invent his recklessness, but it monetized it. And when that recklessness stopped being useful, it withdrew the very structures that had kept him functional. This is how the machine works. You are celebrated when you are entertaining, protected when you are profitable, and forget when you become inconvenient. Charlie Sheen experienced all three phases at maximum intensity. The industry loves origin stories. It loves the rise. But it rarely takes responsibility for the fall, because acknowledging that responsibility would require confronting an uncomfortable truth, that fame, when unregulated, is not a gift. It is a destabilizer, especially when it arrives early, especially when it arrives fast. Charlie's rise was too easy, and ease can be dangerous. When success comes without resistance, it doesn't build discipline. It builds entitlement. It teaches you that consequences are optional and that charm can override accountability. For a long time, Charlie Sheen lived inside that illusion, and so did everyone around him. The cultural response to his collapse revealed something darker. At first, the public laughed, then it was judged, then it moved on. There was very little room for complexity, very little space for understanding how addiction, fame, masculinity, and denial collide in real time. Charlie was framed as a spectacle, not as a case study, and that allowed the system to remain invisible. What makes his story especially revealing is that he survived. Many don't. He lived long enough to see the persona dissolve, long enough to witness the distance between who he was and who he had been pretending to be. Survival forced reflection. And reflection is uncomfortable when your past is public. There is no neat redemption arc here, no triumphant comeback, no moral closure, and that is important, because real life rarely offers clean endings. Charlie Sheen did not become a cautionary tale because he was uniquely flawed. He became one because his flaws were amplified by an environment that rewards extremes. Hollywood didn't ask him to slow down. It asked him to perform over and over until performance replaced identity. When the cameras stopped rolling, Charlie was left with questions most people face privately. Who am I without applause? What do I value when attention disappears? What remains when the persona no longer works? These are hard questions, especially when you've never been forced to ask them before. His relationship with his father becomes especially poignant here. Martin Sheen's legacy is one of introspection, activism, and accountability. A man who confronted his own demons early enough to rebuild with intention. Charlie's path was louder, faster, more destructive. But both men arrived at the same realization from opposite directions. That fame is not meaning, and success is not fulfillment. Charlie Sheen's legacy will always be complicated. He will be remembered for iconic roles, for unforgettable performances, for moments of brilliance that cannot be erased. But he will also be remembered as a warning, not about drugs, not about ego, but about what happens when boundaries disappear. The real tragedy of Charlie Sheen is not that he fell, it's that he was never taught how to stand still. In the end, his story asks something of the audience, not judgment, but awareness. Awareness of how quickly admiration becomes entitlement, of how easily systems confuse tolerance with support, of how fame magnifies whatever is already unresolved inside a person. Charlie Sheen did not lose everything. He lost the illusion. And sometimes that loss is the beginning of truth. Because when the noise fades and the lights dim, what remains is not the headline. It's the human being. And that human being still has to live with the choices made when the world was watching. This is the real story of Charlie Sheen. Not a joke, not a meme, not a spectacle, but a cautionary mirror held up to fame itself.